Hello, everyone. Howdy, y'all. Welcome to another Quorum One Future Work Talk. This is going to be a fun one. And the goal of these future work talks is to give us all a chance to dig into the work of one of our members with a particular lens towards the future of work, future of capitalism, future of democratic systems, emerging technologies, emerging professional practice areas, and all that fun stuff. So today, our guest is Lee Pera. Lee is a geographer and a public policy expert. She worked for many years in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she got to do some amazing work, including helping launch the first software as a service geospatial platform for government. Her work also led her to the tiny home movement, where she's had a tremendous impact helping people navigate complex legal, financial, and zoning hurdles built tiny homes and tiny home villages. And that work also helps bring her into conversation with Indigenous and tribal communities, where she's worked to facilitate greater collaboration and support the emergence and sharing of collective wisdom, which is something that a lot of us here in Point One are very passionate about. And all of this led into the spaces of fractionalized ownership models, blockchain, DAOs, and eventually towards some fascinating experimentation with game-based approaches for organizing large-scale collaborations, using digital maps and video games to help drive coordination around land stewardship and cross-generational collaboration. So lots of interesting stuff for us to dig into on this one. Lee, you were doing amazing work, and I'm so happy to get to talk to you about it. Welcome, and thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Hank.
Awesome. Well, to get us kicked off, I mean, obviously, tiny homes are a huge part of your own professional journey. So, what you could just share with us, how did you get into tiny homes in the first place?
Yeah, I didn't expect to make it part of my professional journey, honestly. It was just more of a personal interest. I grew up, my parents taught at international schools, and so we moved every 2 years. And so I was just constantly, I never really lived in a home for longer than a few years, and I kind of kept up that lifestyle as an adult. So by the time I got to Washington, D.C. in my 30s, and, it's time to maybe buy a house, I have a government job, and I just didn't want to be tied to a 30-year mortgage. I also am a big proponent of, I grew up in a very kind of DIY culture where we can build our own things. My grandpa built my grandma her last house. We were always just building and tinkering. And I fundamentally don't believe in the concept of home and land as commodities. And so I really just wanted to a lot of people were talking about, oh, let's build a tiny house community. No one had done it. I'm like, we're going to do it in the middle of DC and just see what happens. And it was wildly successful. And then it kind of catapulted me onto doing, work with cities around zoning and how do we make this type of housing more accessible given the current zoning restraints and opening that landscape up, and then helping others as well just see that they can build their own homes and don't have to buy a $500,000 home with a 30-year mortgage if they don't want to.
Absolutely, yeah. The 30-year mortgage is a fascinating thing in and of itself. Like the fact that it even exists, and the fact that it's a big part in home ownership in the U.S. But that's a whole separate ball of wax. So I know you've done a lot of other things, and kind of since kind of becoming such a thought leader in the space of tiny homes. So another big part of your story is really games and using games integrated into what some folks would think of it as the working world. So can you talk a little bit about what was your first foray into using games connected with the physical world, and how did the inspiration to do that come up, and how did it get going?
So I haven't been using them. I mean, I'm still our tech person on our team is Lee, you got to go on YouTube and watch people play these games if you're not going to play them. So it's a very nascent thing we're doing, but it came to me because as a geographer, I think we're some of the first people who modeled the physical earth in a digital realm through GIS systems and online maps. As I started learning about gaming, I'm like, wait, so there are these 3D engines, Unity, Unreal, and that's what we do as geographers. We work in the 3D digital space. I'm like, why aren't we building in those tools? And having a nephew and having young people in my life and seeing the games they're playing, especially during the pandemic. And I was talking to my nephew once and I was like, okay, but where's the hope, right? He's like, you're not getting it, Auntie. Like, there is no hope left. We're all warring for like the final resources on Earth. And I'm like, okay, I see you spending all of your time and energy on this. Why aren't we are in a climate catastrophe? We're in apocalyptic times, quote unquote. And so why aren't we having these youth and other people who play games actually use real world data, actually use physical lands where we might be trying to build better communities and gamify that whole process and start to have like challenges. And so that's what we're starting a small pilot outside of San Antonio with a group of folks who have land, a community land project, and some youth and some designers.
Yeah, that's building beyond, right?
Correct. Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
could you talk a bit more about kind of building beyond and kind of like how that started and kind of where it's at now?
Yeah, so it really started during the pandemic. As I mentioned, I've been in the tiny house movement for quite some time. And so I had a lot of people start reaching out to me during the pandemic, right? Everyone wanted to get out of the cities. I want to buy some land. I want a tiny home. I need a backyard office. And so they started reaching out to me and several, folks, especially women who had lands, and they're like, hey, we want to build a community. We know, how to do this economically, because I really did it with very few resources. So I didn't want to charge them like a consultant fee. And I saw them all, they were all doing their own ancestral work. A lot of them had access to ancestral lands, indigenous folks, and just people of color with their own lands in the United States. And then in Mexico as well, people like reclaiming some of the communally held lands. So I was like, wait, you guys are all doing ancestral work. You're all looking at systems for water collection or different ways of building more vernacular housing. Why aren't we creating a network to share knowledge and share resources? So, and I also was doing my own ancestral work at the time and realizing like, oh yeah, that's why I like to move all the time. I come from a nomadic culture and went back up to northern Finland. So we started it, and I think we talked about this. We were trying to put it into the blockchain space because DAOs were really popular. 2022, I think this was, like, everyone's talking about DAOs, and we're like, yeah, that's what we want to do, right? A collective of community builders. Then that just didn't go much because most of the people in our community weren't in the blockchain space or Web3. So we were finding it difficult to talk about what we wanted to build. So we took a little break. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, this gamified process just kind of came to us. And I was like, well, maybe we should test out creating an actual game that's tied to this specific piece of land. And as soon as we decided to do that, it just kind of all started rolling. And we had elders who were interested, and we're doing interviews with elders, and we're building their knowledge into the game. And it's really fun. And what we're hoping to do is like build this system that then others can apply in our network and anyone who's interested really, and take that and apply it to their communities.
That's so cool. I mean, as you know, kind of, I think there's a lot of synergy, kind of shared vision between what we're working on and kind of what we're all working on as sort of core on one, and that approach to how to use games as a way to bring people together, as a way to kind of spread knowledge, share knowledge, way to build connection in community, and potentially even as a way to do real work together is a really powerful thing, right? Particularly as we look at how the world is evolving, it's a really exciting thing to think about. So I'm interested to kind of like a little bit more about how you're, obviously you said during the design process, right? Folks in corporate are always interested in design processes.
Okay.
They're not just like what comes out the other side, but how was this also created? So I'm curious, just like how you started this process of designing this game. Like, what did you do to begin with, and what have you done kind of along the way to try to keep it, along with the vision that you have for it?
So one of my colleagues came, she's from Mexico, but she lives in the States, and she came down and we're like, oh, let's do a work session together for a week, And we literally, the first day we sat down with our computers, it came pouring through. She was seeing it. She's like, oh my gosh, I can see what you're trying to build. I was like, okay. And we just mapped out 10 pages of notes going from a single player game to a multiplayer game. and we don't know anything about gaming. And then fast forward a few months, and we pulled in our colleague Elena, who's very technically, she's so astute and just makes all these connections and very well versed in technology. And so she's been helping us hone in. Okay, y'all, one quest for one thing. Like, you can't overcomplicate this. This is level one. Then we move here. And so we started designing with the actual physical land. So we used sacred geometry for what would be a trail network throughout the whole land. And then we started actually mapping out what the game would be like. And then actually just like 2 weeks ago, we went out to the land, did a little ceremony, asked the land to like kind of speak to us about, you know, we've been waiting. We've really been working with the land and with some of the plants and animals there and the elders, and the land actually gave us some more information, and we saw some new creatures on the land that we hadn't seen before that are now going to be written into the game. And so it's a really cool process to kind of go out and have this idea in mind. And then we're actually physically walking the land in these different points on the land that are in the game where the quests are happening, but then seeing what's going to happen on the land with that. So that's sort of how we've been. It's just been very experimental and kind of a fun project to test this concept out.
It sounds like you've been kind of co-creating with nature, co-creating with the land itself.
Yeah. And there's no water, like water will sometimes be on that land, but there's been a lot of water that's been taken by developers across the other side of the mountain. Of course, that's being built into the game as well.
That's so cool. So how will information from the gameplay migration kind of like feed back into the work that you're planning to do on the land itself?
So basically what we're doing with one youth group is they'll kind of test this for us as we build it, and then they're going to go out and physically build the trails as well. But eventually we're hoping to have challenges. Like, we have other partners in our network, some in California, some are up in Minnesota, who have lands and have projects. And then we could have, challenges in the game, like, oh, we need an off-grid water system here. How do you design it in your geography or from your cultural lineage? And the idea then is that people who play the game, if there's not enough information from the elders in your region or from the ecosystem, then here's the guide on how to get that information. Then you actually go out in the physical world and get it, whether or not it's a data stream from a government agency, or if it's, you interviewing someone in your community about the history of that land.
That's fascinating. How do you see, some of the innovations that are coming out around augmented reality and virtual reality as kind of fitting into?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about that, but our tech person, Elena, that's her world. She's going out to some virtual augmented reality conference next week. And so she's so excited about like actually bringing these ancestors alive on the land as well, and having the headsets available that you could actually, rather than just like talk to them, we're partnering with a small AI company as well to do our own closed small LLM just for this piece of property and see how that would work. So yeah, but she's excited about doing that. I can't speak to that as much. I did try on her Apple Vision Quest. I don't even know what they're called. But the physiological responses were insane. I was like, you guys, my hands are actually sweating. Like, that's how real it was.
Yeah. It's pretty fascinating. So, obviously, can you tell us a little bit more about the aspect of working with like elders or kind of older generation and trying to incorporate aspects of their knowledge and their wisdom into this, and how that plays with kind of the cross-generational piece?
Yeah, so I haven't done as many of those interviews. I've done one with an elder in Mexico, but my colleague Erika is the one who's doing it because it's her land. It's her and her family's land. And so she's been interviewing the elders. And at first they're like, what? What are you trying to do? We're trying to get our youth offline and back to the land, right? And she's like, yeah, but you asked me to share this medicine. She's a traditional healer. However, the broadest way possible. So we're going to the medium of choice where we see our youth, and trying to engage them there and make this fun. And so then they got it and they're excited. And we just got a message when I was there the other week from one of the elders, like, wow, I saw the website and I get it. Thank you. Like, go forth, do this work. It's so important. So that felt really good for us as well.
That's super awesome. But you were talking about the this whole aspect of, where's the hope in so many of these human spaces and so many of these kind of sci-fi spaces. Where is that hope? And so, yeah, it makes me think of um, solar punk, the whole genre of solar punk, which I don't
Right.
know how familiar you are with that.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah, is we talk a lot about solar punk in different kind of quorum ones spaces, because I think we all kind of resonate quite a bit with it. This idea of what does it look like to reclaim some of these futuristic visioning spaces
Hmm.
for a more hopeful and optimistic possible future, rather than getting stuck
Right.
in all of these dystopian.
Doomsday.
Right,
Exactly.
right, right. And
And
what I
really, that's what I mean, I've always worked that way. That's what the tiny house journey was. Like, no, I don't believe in this system. I don't want to have to buy a $400,000 home. I think I can build one myself. And so I've always just been that way. It's like, I'm just going to do this. And so I'm not a game designer, and we're, working with some, but I had to remind myself constantly, who are you to be building this game? I'm like, well, I built my own tiny house without knowing anything about construction and just learned. And, AI is making it, so the good and the bad around AI, it is making it possible for more people to create games and their own, tech stacks.
there's a democratization, right, of a lot of these
Hmm.
really advanced technologies. And so, right, with democratization, with putting these advanced emerging technologies into the hands of more people, you get a lot of benefits. Certainly, you can obviously get a lot more diversity in terms of perspectives that are being brought there in the things that we're building on the other side of it. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like, how have you, for other folks that may be kind of contemplating getting involved in things that perhaps they don't feel qualified to do, or they
Hmm.
feel like, what business do I have, building a video game, right? Or doing whatever it is, particularly around, some of these more emerging technical areas. Like, do you have any advice, or, how have, I don't know, how did you, because you felt that, like an aspect of that, as you just said, right? But you did it anyway. So what was
Right.
that experience like for you? And yeah.
I mean, partly I think it is a personality trait as well. But I also think like we are told so much, and as work has become so specialized, it's like, oh well, I do this, and no one in these highly technical subjects. But as a geographer, I worked on the, like you mentioned, the first software as a service platform in governments. Yeah, that was also a challenge. A lot of GIS technicians are like, no, no one else can do this, and I got to lock down my data, and I'm the only one who can make these maps, right? But once we opened it up and democratized how you can do online mapping through web-based browsers, all of that, through making data services, then they realized, oh, wait, now I can do more of the fun stuff. I can actually go further and do more analysis, not just having to make these simple maps for someone's website.
Yeah.
So this idea of, it's not rocket science, a lot of this. I mean, if you're a curious person, and I mean, what am I going to break if I'm building a video game? I mean, really, my house is a bigger responsibility. I think that could actually kill me, but yeah.
That's a really good point. What's the worst that could happen, and just kind of like do it. So,
Right. Yeah.
as you've gotten more into the process of designing sort of gamified structures and using them to bring people into collaboration, kind of in a more work type sense, like, what lessons do you think that game design offers for organizing teams and managing work in a
Hmm.
more traditional sense? Like, has getting involved in this game design process changed the way that kind of you imagine that the next organization that you create being structured, or the way that you advise other folks to structure their teams?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've just started thinking about that topic because when we were all together as a team the other week, we're like, let's put everything we're doing into this gamified process. So our next quest is X. And we can't think about anything else until we accomplish that. And then we were like, yay, we accomplished it. 'Cause some of us involved are very, all over the place, kind of ADD. So this could actually help my organization of the work itself by gamifying it and knowing like I can't actually go to that next level. Even if I want to, I have to pass this level first, or I have to get these pieces. So that's been kind of fun. I think also, having come from a over decade long career in government, in government, it's very hard to bring people on for short-term contracts, right? And we use contractors, but if you're a government employee, you're there a long time usually. And so this idea of being able to kind of bring in resources or bring in specific skill sets at certain points in the process or certain points, maybe someone doesn't want to be involved. And this is where I do feel like somewhat with the DAOs, I was learning a lot when I was studying those. Someone wants to be involved for 6 months. Then how do you formulate that? We talked a little bit about, the fractional IP that you all are working on. And I think that's super interesting. If we have someone who was like, oh, I want to develop this part of the game. Well, yeah, we would love for you then to get some of the rewards from that. And so really a more fluid and flexible, I guess, way to manage teams and bring people on board. And
Yeah. I think, and then there's this aspect of, what gets me so inspired about, I guess, just, more flexible, more gamified, more lightweight ways for folks to get involved with an organization without necessarily making it look like going through a job on
exactly.
getting
Yeah.
hired, and then onboarding onto the team. There's just so many structures that we think of when we think of how we're going to let people contribute to projects. But this idea of a work structure where you just click a button, it's like signing up for installing out on your phone, your computer, and you can do a little bit, and then go away and come back and do a little bit more. That flexibility, right? And part of what makes me excited about that is just about opening up the diversity of involvement, right? And particularly, I think when you're looking at communities where you have a lot of people who haven't traditionally their opinions haven't been brought in, or their perspectives haven't been brought in. It's, I think, this gamification could, when well done, be a tool for kind of getting more people involved, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so you talked a bit about DAOs,
Mhm.
and right, like, as far with it, visually led to goals and beyond. You initially went down the path of creating a DAO, right?
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could just share a bit about that experience, like how far down this DAO path did you go, and like, what did you learn along the way?
So I spent probably a year and a half just diving deep and being, in Twitter spaces and on Discord and in meetings and looking more at a few DAOs like City DAO, Cohere, different people trying to do like fractionalized ownership for communities. Avon DAO, I think, was another one. And then also at some of the DAO tooling that was happening. So I'm forgetting the names of some of those, but getting onboarded into, here's how would you create it and the voting systems and all of that. And Elena, who's on our team, is heavy in that space, and she does a lot of education for underrepresented populations in that space and like getting people into Web3. But what we realized was that we're kind of putting the tech, we were almost designing our work then to fit into this model rather than just building and then using that model or that structure or the technology when we actually needed it. And we weren't at a point where we actually needed that much complexity, I guess you could say. We didn't have like a huge network of people all having to vote on a common fund. And so we mapped out the whole structure of what it could look like eventually if we have a larger network and we have a common funding pool that's going to fund different community projects. And, I learned some about Web3 gaming as well, which is interesting. And I love the idea of like micropayments, and then that can like funnel into projects. But we never officially set up a DAO. So we spent a lot of time researching and learning and then kind of stepped away from that.
That's an experience that a lot of folks have. A
Mhm.
lot of very pioneer entrepreneurs have had digging into the Web3 space, sort of going that path, and then realizing, like, okay, let's create a DAO, community ownership, community involvement. This really feels like the way of the future. And then,
Yeah.
as you start to get into it, all of these kind of red flags start coming up where you're like, man, this is, how is this complicated? It's starts to
Mhm.
feel a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. So I'm curious, like, coming on the other side of that research process, but what are the parts of the tools and the structures and ideas in the DAO space that you still like have like, yeah, and those are really amazing, and that's kind of why we eventually might go back to that. And then
Mhm.
what are kind of the things on the other side? We're like, well, do you think key problems that would prevent us from kind of
From
fighting
going
out?
in there. Yeah. So I found some small, I was involved in the platform co-op space before DAOs. And so I was really coming with that lens as well. And I'd been involved in co-op movement when I was in college. But what I liked about the DAO format was that ability, like we were saying before, to be able to, put it out there. Here's tasks we need, and find someone who's super bright and smart and they work on a task for 6 months or 1 month, or I loved that part of it. I really do think there's some amazing potential with fractionalized ownership, you might say, yeah, for land-based projects or fractionalized IP, like you all are looking at. So those two things, that ability to be kind of flexible and have everything tied to your unique ledger or whatever, so you can just automatically. And then also, I want to see so many more creator platforms that are, every time I listen to a podcast, I want those couple micropayments going to that person who was interviewed or interviewing that person, right? I want to see more platforms like that. I'm hoping those will continue to surface. What we didn't, well, like I said, I think, unfortunately, although it's called Web 3.0, it still looks a lot like Web 2.0. We used to go to tech conferences and it's the same, it's the same demographic. And I did like a lot of the generational differences. There's a lot of young, great people in this space, but I didn't see enough. Once this space looks like the communities I'm in and working with, well, then maybe. But it was pretty hard to convince folks in our communities to get a wallet, and then wait, I got to buy these coins and got to convert them to this currency in order to donate to your Gitcoin proposal. And what is this? And also, we work with folks who aren't all US citizens. Some might even be undocumented. So, you have to put a lot of ID, to even get a wallet. You have to, so there needs to be a lot more education and easy onboarding and assurances for people about where their data is residing, and especially for those who are more vulnerable.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Sage wisdom. Thanks for sharing all of that. You mentioned a couple times the Gitcoin process, and I know you ended up getting involved with the Gitcoin grant process, and it's a really interesting organization. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit of your own experience working through that Bitcoin grant process, particularly for any groups or projects that are maybe thinking about getting involved with that, or setting up a grant of their own. Do you have any kind of what was that experience like for you, and do you have any kind of recommendation stepping into
it was kind of fun. Honestly, we took ours down. Well, I realized you couldn't take it down, so we wrote one. We got it approved. It went up. And then once we realized how hard it was, we literally had some folks on our team who are in Web3 do some of the first donations, and we all struggled. We're like, wait, we're not going to be, but we were going to do a training call with some people. We don't have time for this. I was in another country. Others were doing their own thing. So we're we'll just take it down and wait till the next round. We can really do community education in our communities. People didn't even have wallets yet, but we ended up getting some money anyways, because random people who saw our proposal were like, oh, that looks cool. So it was fun, because then I went and donated. So once you're in the system, I think it's really fun. And I think it's a great model. This whole idea of the number of supporters you have is what gets you that quadratic funding, right? That matching funding.
Yeah.
Not, oh, I have 5 people, but they all gave me $1,000. But if you have 500 people who all gave you 10 or whatever that, math is, that you'll have. And I get it. They have to, in order that bots and stuff can't, in order for the integrity of the system, it is going to make it a bit onerous to donate. So I guess my only advice would be is that if you're going to do a campaign like that, just to make sure that your community is already comfortable in that space, has wallet set up, and that you've got some training models. And there's actually a couple DAOs, I think 40 Acres DAO is one of them, who are doing training for folks. Here's how to get set up in order to be able to contribute to Gitcoin rounds, because they were realizing, like we were, oh, this is still, it's just the same group of people funding each other's projects. So, yeah.
Yes, there's an old joke about startups just investing in each other. One startup invests in another one, and then they invest in the next one. You just keep passing the money around. Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. That's helpful. It is great. We'll have to include a link to that to the
Hmm.
Bitcoin investor training in the show notes later,
Yeah.
because I think that's really helpful for anybody. So moving a little bit on from the DAO space, quickly. So a lot of things that you and what typically be done as nonprofits, but
Hmm.
you haven't necessarily been focused on that approach. And so I'm curious to just know a bit more about your thinking about nonprofit versus for-profit structures and kind of what guides your own entrepreneurial decisions around which structure to choose.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in nonprofits before, and then obviously living in DC so long, you see the nonprofit industrial complex. Part of our model is that we wanted to be building as much as possible outside of our current structure. So not this like donor recipient. And we also didn't want to be going after VC funding necessarily, although, depending on after we had our pilot done, we might have to do some sort of that type of investment. But that's how I actually came across Quorum One, was researching and finding your zero for profit model. I was like, wait, these guys are already looking at this. We can model us, our work after this. But then part of the reason we got into Web3 was because at that point in time, people were like, Lee, you got to put your work in Web3. There's so much money going around. You should get grants for this. Well, that all fell, a year or so later. But as I started researching the tech space and realizing like, wow, games can make a lot of money, and there's a lot of money being pumped into gaming. And why is none of that actually tied to land-based projects to improve the environment, to improve housing? And so that's really why we decided like, no, not for profit model. Like, no, we're going to like build this in a more kind of traditional, I guess, business model with gaming, because that's where money is. And we want to then funnel that money actually into community land projects, not just have it stay in the tech space. But that's how we came to that decision.
That's interesting. I think there's a lot of folks in the kind of social impact entrepreneurship,
Mm-hmm.
social entrepreneurship movement is going on for a long time. With folks trying to align, profit incentives with these verticals. So I think you're a great company there. What even Corlon has similar, right? And so yeah, I think that's really cool. A lot of folks or a lot of groups in the Web3 space, you'll see them talking about like orgs. I don't know if you've come across this term. You
I
got
don't think I
DAOs.
have.
People
Okay.
talk about orgs, which is kind of like the idea of multi-entity legal structures.
Okay.
You'll have like a nonprofit and then like a traditional like LLC
Right.
type
Okay.
thing. And then maybe you'll have like a co-op. And then there might be like an entity that's like in a specific legal jurisdiction to get certain tax things to work properly. And this idea of,
Right.
you know, like the Star Trek or sort of clawing together all of these different structures into something that helps you work around some of the limitations that are built into some of the legal structures that are available to us as entrepreneurs
Yeah.
now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so then I'm curious, like, to talk a little bit about like this aspect of land. So like, so a lot of the work that you've done is about land use and property rights and zoning, and land use and zoning are so profoundly complex.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so much of that complexity emerges out of the underlying philosophies that we hold around private property. So
Yeah.
how do you personally see the concept of private property? Like, how is it helpful and how does it get in the way?
Right. So I can't talk theoretically or philosophically about this as much anymore. I did study it in grad school like 15 years ago, and I did my research on changing land ownership actually in Costa Rica and Central America as amenity migrants moved there from the north. And we're seeing that now explode, especially in Mexico and post-COVID, right? Like people who can make dollars or euros going to other countries and the impacts that has. But in my career as a geographer, I also did a lot of work on land rights. And so I was mapping with communities, mostly in Latin America, communally held territories, Afro-Colombian territories, indigenous communities in Brazil. Growing up as well, then having lived in the Marshall Islands or my own grandparents even in their history, where private ownership of land wasn't really a thing. And so I continually heard, obviously in the US and working on housing and affordable housing, well, I mean, that's ridiculous. We've always had private ownership of land. How do you even structure a society without that. And I was like, well, but I know that's not the case because I grew up without those concepts in some of the places I lived. So, I certainly don't have the answer. I do think there are some really interesting models happening now, especially with some of the different tribal nations and land back, but then also like leasing that back to the use. You can actually give the land back to tribal jurisdiction maybe, but still be using it in the way that it's being used through long-term leases. We see that happen with ejido lands a lot in Mexico. And that's kind of like an interim model maybe. So yeah, I don't have the answer, but I do think that if we look to original peoples and indigenous communities, they have a lot more to offer in that space than we do in just a Western kind of 200-year history in this country, at least in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting, and I don't have nearly as much experience myself in really looking at private property really deeply on a sort of physical land level. I think there's a lot of parallels between that space and ideas and other forms of, like, say, intellectual property.
Mm-hmm.
And I often think about open source software and a lot of the innovation that we seen come out of the open source software movement and sort of be built on the backs of the open source software movement. And then I just wondered what lessons does that have to
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because ideas on one level are you could argue much more amenable to shared or open ownership models because they can be replicated infinitely at very low cost. But still, there is some aspect of like more shared structures for thinking about
Right.
things that you typically think of as one by just one. This is here one group.
And I was hoping within, that's kind of what also drew me to blockchain was I was hoping to find more models of fractionalized, let's just say ownership of land or fractionalized stewardship models. And what I was finding more was fractionalized investment structures, right?
Yeah.
And so we're still treating the land as like, oh, I'm going to make a return on my investment. I can't afford to buy my own apartment or buy my own piece of land. But in Japan, for instance, like they're doing fractionalized. So you can invest in kind of like an REIT, but it's actually physically a piece of that building or a piece of that land. And I was like, okay, well, that's not really getting at the underlying issue still, because we're still treating it as this thing that we're going to get a financial return on. So I'm hoping that will open up more in with blockchain and with some of the technology that we're going to be open up new models and of how we actually steward land collaboratively.
100%. We were talking with I'm so sorry with David Thompson for earlier one of these sessions a few weeks back. Who I think he does a lot of work around fractionalized ownership models, particularly in the arts.
Okay.
Films,
yeah, I did see some of that interview. It was great.
It's a great conversation. What the work that he does and kind of what he advocates for is deconstructing the notion of ownership. What is ownership into a set of different rights that can be fractionalized and can be shared. And so what I hear you speaking to is so many folks in this free space, like have this amazing technology that could enable kind of any type of fractionalized, but again, we're still having our imaginations a little bit constrained by the idea of, okay, this land is owned by this person, this entity, or this group of people. And it's like, well, what does it look like to have all the different things? If we, creative control over what happens on the land is one piece, or, the just the ability to spend time on it or whatever is another piece. And then sharing that a lot of different ways that are a lot more flexible than like a fractionalized sort of time sharing investment type thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so cool. I know we are coming up on time. Maybe just time for kind of one more question here. So some of the ecosystem transformation type of work that many of us do eventually runs kind of works back into government next, right?
Yes.
And all of the unique challenges that come along with public sector collaboration. The opposite government is not known for its rapid pace of innovation necessarily. So I know this can be especially good value for folks coming from the tech space. And I know you've been on
Right.
both sides of this, working in government and kind of working more on the tech side, more on the community side. And so, can you share your thoughts on just like how systems changers can best partner with government, with public sector organizations,
Mhm.
to do these big, ecosystem transformation type efforts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is to always, I feel like from the tech folks to treat things as a pilot. And so we can't necessarily always do open source, even if we want to, because we don't have the technical capacity in-house to be able to continually build that. So we have to go to contractors. And then those are usually long-term contracts, and it's easier to use, companies that have software as a service because they're doing all the maintenance then. So I think a lot of people don't understand that. We have, fellows who were part of the digital services fellows, and they would come in with these grandiose ideas. We're going to totally do a, transformation of this IT process, and then realized how difficult it is with procurement and hiring processes in government to do that at a quick scale, I mean, a quick time frame. But there are things you can do. I did a lot of sole source contracts where then you can just choose an entity or a company, if it's under 100K, who's doing really cool innovative work to test out something. So I feel like we got to work with more interesting companies in those spaces, or doing a pilot or a partnership. I worked a lot with tribal governments as well, and sometimes they had a little bit more flexibility if it was just for one project. So it's really looking at it less of like, I'm going to go and transform this whole ecosystem, and more of, oh, let's pilot this one thing with this one program office or this one state agency and figure out how that piece of the technical architecture can fit in.
So it's like small, essentially,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Very small, focused on how to and get in particular, when needed, on how to get through that procurement process by maybe coming up in under the threshold that they have for needing to do a full RFP or whatever.
And
And then
sometimes partnering with a larger contractor, which kind of goes against, I think, our thought process, but it can be helpful because they need subs. And it is a way to then get into the government contracting space if that's where you want to be.
Yeah.
But I would say create great data. I mean, honestly, as someone who worked on the systems, and if you're a person or your company deals a lot with data, or you have like creating good, usable data, that's what we need. Yeah.
This has been great. If anyone out in the audience has any questions they want to add in, I'd say go and share them now. Otherwise, I think this has been such a fun conversation, Lee. I appreciate your time, and for being. I appreciate you for being a part of the forum. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy I found you all. I've learned so much already, so excited to keep participating.
Ditto. All right.
Okay.
We'll wrap it
Thanks,
there.
Shane. Thanks
All
all.
right, thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.